Welcome everyone, I am Tock Custom, and we're finally doing the button-down shirt tutorial video. So by the end of this, you're going to learn how to make a shirt that looks just like this. Alright, so first we're going to talk about what you need to get started, and then we are going to just jump right into making a shirt. Alright, now to get started making our shirt, you're going to need some kind of a pattern, and I already did a video on how to read and make your own pattern, so if you missed that, you might want to go back and watch that. Otherwise, if you've seen it, you should have your pattern all made up. Now I've got about 3 yards of a woven cotton fabric here, and I think I need about a yard of a fusible shear weight interfacing. If you don't know what that is, I'll explain it when we get to that part. Then you'll need some cutting tools, and I've got 6 buttons. If you want to do the top collar button, you'll need 7 buttons, and then you're going to need like a sewing machine and thread and maybe some top thread and things like that. So I'll explain it as we go along, and I've got plenty of coffee here, so I think we're ready to get started. And obviously the first thing we have to do is cut our fabric, so we're going to get ready to cut this out. Alright, so I am going to lay out my fabric, and I've got this folded in half. My fold line is over on this side, and it is extremely important that you pre-wash your fabric before you make any clothing ever. If you do not pre-wash your fabric and then you go and wash this stuff, your clothes will shrink and they will look really weird. So make sure you pre-wash your fabric. Okay, so I'm not going to explain how to lay and cut everything out, but the one thing I will explain is that this back piece right here has got to be lined up with the fold line of my fabric. So when I cut it out, it's gonna open up as one big solid symmetrical piece. So every other panel of your pattern can just be cut out anywhere on the fabric that it fits, and it's going to cut out 2 of every shape since this is folded in half. Alright, so we've cut out all our pieces, and I am going to pull out our interfacing and show you how we cut that out now. Now we have to cut out a few pieces of fusible interfacing from our pattern. If you don't know what fusible interfacing is, it's the stuff that makes your collar stiff or the cuffs in a dress shirt stiff, and it will fuse to your fabric and add some more strength and stability to your fabric. Alright, now the way fusible interfacing works is you've got a bumpy side and you've got a smooth side. So the bumpy side has got all these little dots of adhesive that when you heat it up and press it with an iron will fuse to your fabric. So that's the way this works. Now for this pattern, we have to cut out 1 piece of interfacing for the collar stand, 1 piece for the collar, and then we have to cut out 2 pieces of interfacing for the 2 plackets that we have. Alright, so now we've got all of our interfacing cut out, so you should have 2 pieces for your front button plackets, your collar stand and your collar interfacing itself. Alright, now that all of our fabric and our interfacing is cut out, now it's time to cut out our notches. Now, some people do this differently, but the way I do it is, if it's a single notch, I will cut out a little diamond on the inside. Very small, you don't want to cut past the seam allowance. And then if it is a double diamond like this one, I'm going to just cut a wider V. And I don't cut the fabric completely out. Now over here I've got a single one, so I'm going to cut out a single V. We've got one more here. And the purpose of these notches is every different piece has little notches that help you line up your panels with each other so that everything fits perfectly. Now in this example, there's a big dot right here, and this is where your center shoulder seam is going to come together. So what I always do is I just do a single cut right where that dot is. So I know that when I put my sleeve on, this little split in the fabric here is going to match up with my center shoulder seam. Okay, now I'm just going to very quickly go through all of my different patterns that have notches, and I'm going to cut those out. And when I am done cutting these out, I will show you what our first steps in sewing are. Just as a quick example of how I cut out my notches, if it's a single notch like that, I'll just cut out a simple little triangle. And if it's a double notch like this, I will cut 2 little slits so that it will fold back. I don't actually cut that out just because it takes too much time. But I can clearly see that this is a double notch and this is a single notch. All right, so this is still a shirt making tutorial, but it's also a pattern reading tutorial, so I'm going to make a few references to the actual pattern. Now, on step 1, it just tells us to interface everything, so let's do that. So let's interface all of our parts. All right, now I'm going to use our collar as an example of something that we're going to interface. So your collar is going to be in 2 pieces, and we are going to put interfacing on one piece of this, and I will show you how that makes sense as we move along with the construction. But thankfully, this fabric doesn't have a right or a wrong side. It's really the same on both sides, but what you want to do is you want to lay the bumpy side of your interfacing onto the wrong side or the inside of your fabric. All right, now, I always start in the middle when I do my interfacing, so I am just going to put some nice heat there, and this is on the cotton setting. And I'm just going to very slowly kind of roll the interfacing. And if it kind of goes over the edges of the fabric, that's totally okay because we can trim that off. But I just want to smoothly fuse this interfacing to my collar panel here. All right, so now we've got one piece of our collar interfaced and the other side is not. And we're not going to talk about how this works just yet, but I'm going to take these and set these aside. So for the collar stand, we're going to do the same exact thing where I'm going to take my interfacing and I'm going to fuse it to just one of the pieces. All right, now I'm going to set these aside. And for our plackets, there are 2 pieces. So don't forget, there is a notch. I don't know if you can see that on camera, but there's a notch right there. So I just want to make sure that these are mirror images. And then I am going to put interfacing on one side. And again, if you have a patterned or textured fabric, make sure that this is going on the wrong side or the ugly side of the fabric. All right, now you should have 2 interface pieces for your plackets. One of your collar stand and one of your collar pieces should be interfaced, and now we're good to go. All right, so now we're going to look back at our pattern, and we've got steps 2 through 7 that tell you how to do a breast pocket on your shirt. But I already filmed a video on that, so if you click on the little thing up here, it will take you to a video of me teaching you how to do your very own breast pocket. Or if this makes sense to you or you don't want breast pockets, you can just skip all of these steps altogether. All right, so looking at the next page, I can see that steps 9 all the way through 16 are not the version of the shirt that we're making, but I want to take a closer look at step 17 here. All right, in the last video, we talked about doing the pattern for shirt style A right here, which is the short sleeve collared shirt. So on the pattern, it says all views, so that includes pattern A. So we are going to do this step. All right, so this is the first time we're actually constructing pieces. So I'm just going to read this. It says stitch back and front sections together at shoulder. So it shows you little dotted lines where we're going to sew. So let's show you how that looks in real life. All right, so you're going to need your front panels and your back panel. And I did my breast pocket and a little embroidery just to make this look nice and spicy. So I'm going to take my back panel and I'm going to open this up. Now, you want to lay this right side up. So if you have textured fabric, make sure that you can see the pretty side of your fabric here. What I want to do now is I want to lay my fronts right sides together with the right side of my back panel, and it wants us to match up our shoulder seams like this. So I'm going to take a pin, I'm going to put it on the left side of my left shoulder, and then a pin on the right side. And you know what? Because this fabric is really delicate, I'm going to do 3 pins. Then I'm going to do the same thing for this other shoulder seam. All right, because this is an intermediate project, I'm not going to show you every single stitch on the machine. So I'm going to do a stitch right here and right here on these shoulder seams at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, just like the pattern said. All right, so you should have something that looks like this. So we've got our nice clean straight stitches on our shoulder seams, and because I have a serger, I'm going to be serging all of these seams so that it stays nice and clean on the inside. All right, so I chose to serge the inside of my seam, and then just to show you the outside here, I also did a top stitch on there. So I've got a nice solid black top stitch, and that also will hold the seam in place on the inside so that that won't move around at all. So that's how I'm going to finish my seams. There's lots of different options, but you guys can do whatever you are comfortable with. All right, so the next step says sleeves and side seams, and then it gives you this really terrible picture that I didn't understand when I was brand new at sewing, but I figured it out. So I'm going to show you how to do this in real life without having to figure it out on your own. So anyway, you should have something that looks like this if you lay it out. So I got my back panel, I got my left front, and my right front. These are our shoulder seams. So what I'm going to do is, if I take this whole shirt and turn it to where the right front and the back come together, it's going to make this big armhole. This is where our right sleeve is going to go. All right, so I'm going to be honest. Doing the sleeves is my least favorite part of making a shirt. It's not that it's hard, but you'll know why when you end up doing this. So anyway, this should be the right side of your fabric facing up, and you are going to be putting right sides of your sleeves together. So that little circle on our pattern should have left you with a little split. And we're going to match up right sides together with where that dot was on our pattern with our center shoulder seam here. All right, so you can see that on the front panel there's a single notch here, and on the back panel there's a double notch cut out. So you need to make sure that your sleeve matches up properly, otherwise your sleeves will be on backwards. So my double notch is here, so I'm going to match up my double notch of my sleeve with the double notch on my shirt. And I'm going to put a pin right there. And then before I do the front, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull these two pins that we just put together nice and tight, and we have to try to line the fabric up. So I'm going to be like pulling this from the back. So what I want to do is find the center point between those two pins and try to line the fabric up so that these edges are flush with each other. And I'm going to put a pin right there. Now I'm going to do the same thing between these two pins, where I'm just going to line up the direct edge of that fabric so it's nice and flush, and I'm going to put a pin there. And do this as evenly as you possibly can. Sometimes you will get some pleats, and I will show you how to fix that if that happens. And again, I'm just going to keep putting pins and lining up the fabric so it's nice and flush. I'm going to do this all the way to the edge of where our armpit will be. So now from this point, I'm not going to match up these edges here. I'm just going to make sure that these stay nice and flush with each other all the way to the edge. Okay, so now we have the entire back side of the sleeve done, and there's about ½ an inch of fabric left over, and that's okay, and I'll show you why later. So we have the back half of the sleeve done. Now, we want to match up our front single notch of our sleeve with the front single notch of our front panel. I'm going to put those together so they're flush, and then I'm going to put a pin to keep those in place. All right, now I'm going to do the same thing where I'm going to try to find the center of both panels of fabric by pulling these tight, and then I'm going to do my very best to make sure that those edges of fabric are nice and even with each other, and put a pin between those two. Do the same thing where I put a pin between these two pins so everything is nice and even, and then I'm going to do one more right here. Actually, this is going pretty well. And again, I'm not going to try to line up this outside edge, even though this seems to be kind of working out a little bit here, but I'm just making sure that this stays nice and flat and even all the way to the edge. And yep, there's a little bit of extra fabric on the top side here, and that's also okay. All right, now hopefully you have something that looks kind of like this here. So this is our center shoulder seam up top, and then we've got everything pinned as flat as possible all the way to these edges. The reason this is so hard is because you're taking two very curved pieces of fabric and trying to pin them together in a way that feels very unnatural. But if you're able to do this, you've done a very good job. Now, I think I'm going to show you how to do this on the machine, but what you have to do is you have to pick this up, and I'm going to try to lay this flat in a way where I'm going to be sewing on a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance all the way from here all the way up here. But what's going to happen is this fabric is going to start to kind of pull, so I have to keep shoving this under like this while I'm feeding this seam through the machine to make sure that I don't sew through any unwanted fabric. And I'll try to explain that as we're doing this on the machine right now. All right, so here we are doing our sleeve seam. So I'm going to start at the end where my pin heads are on top, and I'm going to do my very best to show you guys how I'm doing this. So again, I'm at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, and I'm going to do a back stitch, just like I always do. Now I am going to try to pull out my pins as I'm sewing this, and the important thing is that you're looking underneath your fabric the entire time to make sure everything is tucked under like that. Otherwise you're going to find yourself sewing through parts of your shirt that you don't want to. So I'm just going to keep following this line, and I'm going to pull out my pin every time I get the chance, and every time I pull out my pin, I tuck the fabric underneath. So far this is going very well. So now I am officially at the center shoulder seam, and everything is still nice and tucked under here so that I'm not sewing through anything I don't want to. And I'm just following this curve. It curves very heavily here. Okay. Just make sure you keep looking underneath your fabric as much as you're looking on top. Again, forgive me for being overly thorough during this part, but this is one of those things that once you get it right, it looks really, really good. Alright, so actually at this point, the hard part is over. Now it's pretty much just a straight stitch all the way out, and I don't have to worry about anything underneath. Everything is looking pretty sharp right now. Alright, now I'm going to backstitch to finish that sleeve seam, and we are officially done with doing our first sleeve seam. Alright, so on the front and back side of my entire seam, everything came out nice and smooth. I didn't get any pleats, which is exactly what you want. Now I'm going to serge this entire seam. I don't do any top stitching with this, but I will clean this up and serge this whole seam right here. I'm going to make this real quick, but if you have a serger and you're doing your sleeves, be extremely careful, because if you make a mistake, it will cut into your fabric and it will ruin your project. So if you're serging, make sure that this is tucked under at all times. Otherwise, you cannot recover from an error like that without starting over. Alright, we got this all done, so let's take it over to the table and see how it looks. Alright, so here's how mine turned out, and actually this looks really clean. I'm actually pretty happy with this. So here's our shoulder seam here, and this is all the inside of the shirt. So if I flip this over... Alright, and here's how it looks on the outside, and it's hard to make this lay flat because it's meant to kind of drape around your body, but this looks nice and clean, so I think we did a good job on our first sleeve. I'm going to do the other one, and then I will show you guys what is next. Alright, so now we've got our sleeves on, we've got our two front panels, and we've got our center back panel here. So now let's take a look at the pattern and see what it says to do next. Alright, so now we're at the side seams here, and this one's really easy to understand. So it just says pin the front and back sections together at the sides, all the way up from the bottom, all the way to the tip of the sleeve. So I'll show you how that looks right now. Alright, so basically I'm just going to take my shirt here, and I'm going to lay this so that the right side is facing up, and I'm just going to do one side at a time here. So I've got my sleeve facing out that way, this is my front, and here is my back laid out all flat. So all it wants us to do is to fold this in half so that right sides are together, so you should be able to see the inside of your seam here. Alright, so now I'm just going to match up the corner of where the sleeve will come together here. And I'm going to put a pin right there. And then I'm going to match up the bottom side seam of the shirt right here. And I'm going to put a pin right there. Now right here, there's a double notch, which might be hard for you to see on camera, but I can see that those match up fine right there. So I know to put a pin there. And then I always put a pin where the two seams of where the armpit will be, so that those match up properly. So I'm going to put a pin right here. Also, there's another set of notches in the middle of the sleeve, which is pretty easy to see. So there's another pin right there. So now that I've got all my focal points of where those pins go, I can start pinning the rest. So all we have to do to pin the rest is just pull between this pin here and this pin here nice and tight so that the fabric lines up nice and flush. I always find the center point, and I'm going to put a pin between those two areas. I'm going to do the same thing right here where I pull it tight, put a pin right here, and then I'm going to put one last pin right between these two over here. So now this is all pinned up and ready to go, and I'm going to actually pin up the other side so we can do both stitches at the same time. Alright, so you should have something that looks like this. So we've got the bottom side seams pinned up all the way up to the armpits and then to the outside of the sleeves. Now I'm not going to show you how to do this on the machine because it's pretty simple, but I'm just going to do a straight stitch from here at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance all the way through the armpit seam into the edge of the sleeve. And then I'm just going to serge and overlock this whole seam right here. Alright, so my side seams are done, and you should clearly be able to see my regular stitch right here, and then I did my overlock serge stitch all the way up so that it looks nice and clean. Alright, so now we're on steps 20 and 21, and this tells us how to hem the opening out of our sleeves. Now I kind of skipped this because I'm a little bit more comfortable with just going right to doing a top stitch. So I am going to show you how I do this on the machine right now. The first thing you're going to want to do is most machines have a little can that you can take off here, and it's going to allow you to wrap fabric around your machine like this, which is great for sleeves and pant legs and stuff like that. Alright, now I'm going to try to show you how I get started doing my hems. So I've got this right side out, so I've got the outside of my sleeve here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this over about 1/2 inch, so it looks like that on the inside, but then there's all this raw edges, so I'm going to roll this over one more time. So now I've got a nice beginning of a rolled hem, and I'm going to do this right on that armpit seam underneath your arm. So that's how I start. So I've got this rolled up, and I'm going to put this under my presser foot, and I'm going to put the foot down right there. Now, I'm going to kind of wrap my sleeve around the entire arm of my sewing machine here. And what I'm going to do is, it's going to be really hard to see this. You have to kind of feel it. But I've got my raw edge of my fabric on the sleeve here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold this over about 1/2 inch like we just did, and then I'm going to roll this over again underneath one more time. And I'm going to pull this kind of nice and tight so I can feel that from right where the presser foot is all the way up to where my pinched thumb is here, that's rolled over, and as I'm sewing, it's going to lock a rolled hem in place. I'm not going to iron this. I'm just doing this kind of freehand because I've done it a lot, and it takes a little bit of practice, but it's really not that hard. Now, while I'm doing this, I can feel where that rolled hem is in there. So I'm going to try to line that up so it's just to the left of where my needle is. So I'm going to do a few stitches to start. And now as I'm moving, I'm just going to keep making sure that I am tucking and rolling my fabric underneath as I go. So I'm going to go about 3 or 4 inches at a time. And as I get to where my pinched fingers were, I'm going to, again, find the raw edge, do a 1/2 inch fold over, and then another fold over again. Pull that nice and tight, and I can kind of see and actually feel where that is. And I'm just going to keep doing this about 3 or 4 inches at a time until it goes all the way around the entire sleeve. Now as I'm coming up to where we started, I can see my stitches here, so this is actually going to start kind of holding its shape by itself, so I don't really have to pinch it anymore because the stitches are holding it in shape. So now I just have to complete this stitch, and I want to make sure that my stitches line up with where they started. And I'm going to trim those very close. So as you can see, this is where we started right here, and we've got a nice rolled hem all the way around. And if I look at the inside, you can see that it's locked up all of those raw edges on the inside so that it's going to stay nice and clean, and you won't have to worry about any frayed fabric or anything like that. So this is a very well done rolled hem. Now I'm just going to do the same thing on the other side, and then we will see what the pattern says to do next. Alright, so we just did our sleeve rolled hem, but then all of these steps, 22 all the way through 33, are how to do dress sleeves. And since we're not making a dress shirt, we can skip all the way to step 34. I will do a tutorial on how to do a dress shirt and cuffs, but not in this video. All right, now step 34 tells us that we're going to do a narrow hem all the way around the bottom of our shirt. Now, because the bottom of our shirt is curved, it can be kind of hard to do that, unlike what we just did with the sleeve. So I'm going to show you a trick to make this a lot easier right now. All right, so we've got our shirt on an ironing board here, and this is the entire length of the bottom, and this is the wrong side of the fabric because we can see the inside of our seams right here. So doing a freehand rolled hem on a curved edge like this can be kind of challenging, so I'm going to show you a simple way to do this so that you get nice clean results. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start at the center bottom, and I'm going to roll this up about 1/2 inch or 1 seam allowance right here, and I'm going to iron this. And I'm going to iron it at that exact same length all the way around from the center all the way to my left side, and then I'm going to start and do that all the way to my right side. Alright, so that all looks really good, and you just want to make sure it's nice and flat. You don't want any puckering or any ripples in your fabric at all, so take your time if you need to. And now, since this is a rolled hem, we pressed it once, we're going to roll this one more time, just so that that is the same distance as our first press, and I'm going to do the exact same thing from the center all the way around to each edge, just like we just did. Alright, so now you should have something that looks like this all the way around the bottom, and this just makes it so much easier to keep track of while we're sewing, because what we have to do is we have to flip the whole shirt over, and we're going to be sewing on the right side of the shirt while this under here is tucked under. So just like we did on the sleeves, I'm going to be kind of feeling this and just trying to do my best to stitch as close to the edge of the inside of this rolled hem. So I don't think I'm going to do a close-up of this stitch because I think you guys get the idea of how to do a hem, but I am going to just do this real quick. Alright, I lied. I'm going to actually just do a close-up. So anyway, I've got the right side of my fabric here, and if I look under, I can see my rolled hem that we just pressed. And trust me, it makes it a lot easier. If you are comfortable with freehanding this, go for it. But otherwise, sometimes I still do this just to make sure that it turns out very polished. So I am just going to start on one end, and I'm going to do a stitch all the way until we run out of fabric. Okay, so when you get to the end, I've got a little extra fabric poking out, so I'm just going to trim that off along with my stitches. And then on our starting end, I am going to do the same thing where I just kind of clean that up. And we are all done with our bottom hem. Really quick, it's normal to see a little bit of rippling like this after you do a hem like that, so I'm just going to press this nice and flat, and that's going to smooth everything out, and then everything on both the outside and the inside are going to look nice and clean. Now our hem is going to look nice and clean, and that is in good shape forever. Alright, so now that we're done with our bottom hem, we're going to be doing the front band or the placket, the collar, and the collar band. So first we're going to start with the front band where the buttons and the buttonholes go. So it's going to tell you to turn over one edge of this by 3/8 of an inch, and I'm not going to do that yet. I always do that after I sew it onto the actual shirt. So I'm going to show you how I do this. Alright, so here's the left front edge of our shirt, and here is the left front band of our shirt. Now there is a notch right here and right here, so those are going to match up. So what I want to do is I want to put these together so they're right sides together, and you should know that because there should be interfacing on the back side of your band already. Alright, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to pin where these two notches match up first, and then right where this curved edge of the band ends, I want to match that up with the edge of the front of our shirt here. Because this is exactly where our stitch is going to start, and if we do it properly, it's going to look nice and even. So I've got a pin here and here. Now the band is always going to be longer than your shirt, and that's totally okay, and I'll explain why later. But all we have to do is just make sure this is nice and smooth and even, and that these raw edges are nice and flush. So I'm going to pin this all the way down to the bottom. All right, so now I'm going to pin my other side. All right, so both of these are ready, so I'm just going to do a back stitch at the top, do a straight stitch all the way down at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, and then another back stitch at the bottom. Okay, so we've got our band stitched into place, which looks really good. But I like to thin out this seam, and I'll tell you why. Because what we're going to end up doing is our band is going to roll over like this, and then we're going to fold it in half eventually. And you're going to have that seam tucked on the inside. And if it's really bulky in there, when you sit down, this is going to pinch and it's going to bubble up and it'll look really weird when you move around. So I like to thin this out, and I'm going to show you how I do that. All right, now I don't want to cut this too close to the stitches because we need a little bit of seam left over to press to one side. So what I usually do is I cut about halfway between the edge of the fabric and where the stitches are. And I'm going to do that all the way down so that I've got just a little bit less fabric to deal with when we end up kind of closing this up and finishing our front bands. So now this is a little bit thinner, which is going to make this a lot easier, and it's going to drape a little bit better when we finish our shirt. Now, the next thing we want to do is this seam needs to be pressed towards the band itself, because that's going to end up getting hidden on the inside. And this will make a lot more sense as we do the next step after this. But basically, I just want to press this whole seam, and I'm going to kind of pull the band so that the fabric lays nice and flat while I'm doing this. But I want to press that whole seam. Again, I'm kind of spreading the fabric apart while I do this so that on the outside we've got a nice flat seam. All right, so now that that seam is pressed, we're going to flip the shirt over and we're going to be looking at the raw edge of our band right here. Now the previous step we skipped, and I like to do this after just because it's a little bit easier. So it told us to roll this over about 3/8 of an inch like that, so it's about even with the seam that we trimmed. And it wants us to press this into shape, and I'm going to do this all the way from the center, all the way up to the top, and then all the way to the bottom. All right, this is looking perfect. So we've got our seam pressed in towards the band, and then we've got this rolled over one time and pressed. All right, so now what we want to do is take this edge and we're going to fold this in half so it's just barely going past where those stitches were right there, okay? And I am going to press this with an iron so that we've got a good starting point here. All right, so now as I zoom out, I'm going to be following this edge so that we're folding this entire band in half so that it is just barely going past where the stitches of that seam were. And I'm going to press this in half all the way up to the top and then all the way down to the bottom. And make sure you do a really good job of pressing this so that it stays in really good shape while we're stitching this into place. All right, now as we take a closer look, you should have something that looks like this. And if I just barely pull this back, you should see your stitches hiding right underneath that edge immediately. So it should look like that. And then on the outside of our garment, it should look something like this, where you can barely see a seam right there. So that's exactly what we want. All right, now as we prepare this for sewing, I'm going to take the tip of a pin and I'm going to put it right as close as I can to the edge of that folded over fabric. I'm going to push it through and lock that in place, and I'm going to leave the head of the pin pretty far away from the edge of that fabric. Now I'm going to do this again one more time right here, and we're going to go all the way up to the top and all the way down to the bottom so that this stays locked in place just like that. So when you're done, you should have something that's pinned in place all the way like this, and I'm going to leave the bottom open, and I'm going to show you why right now. Okay, now the pattern itself does a terrible job of explaining how to finish the bottom of your band right here. So I'm going to explain it as simply as I can. So this is how it looked originally. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open this up. We're going to flip this over. So it should look like that. I'm going to fold this in half so that this edge here matches up with this edge like that. Okay? Now, I'm going to put a pin through these layers right here, right on the edge. Hopefully you can see that. So it should look something like this. This is the outside of the shirt, and then the inside of the shirt should look like that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this over to my sewing machine, and what we're going to try to do is follow, again, the bottom of this hem. We're going to do a stitch right in line with that across all the layers of this all the way to the other side. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip this over, and I'm going to pull up my pin and hold this in place with my finger. So what I'm going to do is line up my needle so I know it's going to match up with the line of this hem right here. So I'm going to do a back stitch on the outside edge first, and then I'm going to move closer inside. We're going to stitch right up to where that bottom of the hem is. I'm going to do a double back stitch to make sure it stays nice and strong. And then I'm going to cut my thread. All right, now what I want to do is trim as close as I can to the stitches that we just did without cutting through them. Doesn't have to be like crazy close, but pretty close. So something like that should be fine. And now, since we're going to be turning this right side out, this top right point right here, I'm going to just barely trim off the top corner without cutting through those stitches to thin that out, because we're going to make a nice clean point in a moment. So that's how you finish the bottom of your bands, and we're going to take this over to the table and I'm going to show you why this made sense. All right, so here's what we just did, and this looks really good. So now what we want to do is we're going to turn this so it's all right side out, and I've got this little seam turner here to help me get that corner nice and clean. So now the bottom of our front bands are done, and I'm going to try to lay this flat. All right, so you can see where we had it pinned up to before, and now that we've got this all nice and polished, I'm going to press this into shape, just like we did before with the rest of it. And now I'm just going to finish pinning this like we did earlier. All right, so finally this thing is fully prepared. The bottom is all squared up, which looks great. Everything is pinned up properly, so this is where we want to be. All right, so now let's flip our shirt over. So we're going to be looking at this from the right side of the fabric now. So this is the front left of my shirt. All right, so here's the center bottom of our left front. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a straight stitch starting right where my fingertip is here. We're going to go on the inside of this seam all the way up to the top. Now I can see and feel where my pins are, so I'm going to pull my pins out as I'm sewing up here. And we're going to be sewing all the way up to the top of the front of our band here. All right, so now here's the inside of our shirt. And the reason that we stitched the outside right along the inside of this front band is it's going to stitch through all these layers, and it's going to lock this in place so that you don't get any frayed edges, and this is going to look really clean on both the inside and the outside. All right, now I do want to show a close-up of how I do this. So I'm going to line up my needle with about 1/8 of an inch from the right side of that seam. And I'm going to take my first pin out in advance because I don't want to run over that right away. Now I'm going to start with a couple of slow stitches, and then I'm going to do a back stitch to make sure that looks good. Now, I'm going to kind of pull the fabric tight a little bit, not too tight, but a little bit towards me, to make sure everything underneath stays nice and flush. And I'm going to sew this at about 1/8 of an inch all the way up. And when I see a pin like I see here, I'm going to reach under on my left side. I'm going to pull that out, and I'm going to continue on. I'm going to do this all the way until I get to the top. All right, now as I get to the top, I'm going to do a back stitch right before the edge, and then just let it run all the way off, trim my thread, and we are done with the inside of that. All right, so here's the outside of what we just did, and as I look at the inside, I can tell that I caught that inside lining edge just perfectly all the way from top to bottom. So that is exactly what you want to see there. Okay, so the next step is for us to top stitch all the way from the outside edge all the way down to the bottom, and then we're going to pivot along the bottom and stitch into right here. But sometimes you might see a little bit of rippling like I see right here, so I'm going to go and press this on my ironing board so that this all lays nice and flat, and then we're going to come back and I'll show you how to top stitch it. All right, so I just went and ironed this, so this is all nice and flat, which is great because it's going to make it a lot easier to top stitch. Now, on the bottom left front, I always start at this angle here, where I'm going to be following the very bottom And this is all just decorative top stitch, but this will help it hold its shape. So I'm going to do a few stitches along the bottom, a couple of back stitches to keep it in place. And we're going to go all the way to this bottom corner. And then I'm going to lift my foot, do a pivot, and now we're going to stitch all the way up to the top. And when I'm doing this stitch, I'm going to try to stay as close to the edge as I possibly can, because it's going to give you a really polished look. So if you need to go slow, that's fine. But I just want to make sure this stays nice and even. And when you get to the top, you don't have to do this part because the collar is going to end up covering that up. Now, from the bottom all the way up to the top, we've got top stitch on either side, which looks really good, and everything on the inside is nice and clean. So when I do the other side, just because of the way the fabric sits, I have to start at the top, and then I work my way down to the bottom. All right, now as I get to the bottom, I'm going to lift my foot and do a pivot, and then I'm going to stitch into the inside of our band here and do a back stitch just to lock that up, and then cut our thread and clean up anything that is loose. All right, so now we got both sides top stitched and they should be locked in place and looking good, so we are officially done with the front bands. All right, so the last thing we actually have to attach to the shirt is the collar and the collar stand. Now, we don't need the collar stand right now. We're just going to be looking at the collar. All right, so first make sure that your non-interface collar is right side up. So you should be able to see the pretty side of the fabric here. And then we're going to put the other interface piece of the collar right on top of it so that they're right sides together. Now, these are right sides together, so I am going to pin kind of the top corners first. And then I'm going to pin the actual corners of the collar itself. And then just to keep this thing together, I always put a couple of pins in the center areas. All right, now this part is very important. So we're going to stitch at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance from the top left corner right down to this corner here, all the way across to this corner, and then back up here. Do not sew this edge here closed because we need to flip this right side out when we're done. So I'm not going to do a close-up on this, but I'm going to go and stitch that just like we said. Okay, so now on the collar, I'm going to trim this very, very close to the stitches, because as we turn this right side out, we want the edges to be nice and crisp. So I am going to use my rotary cutter to trim that. And then I'm going to do this long edge also. All right, now on the corners of our collar, it's really important that we clip these corners as close as we can to those stitches without going through those stitches. So I'm going to do that on both sides of the corners of my collar. All right, so now we have something that looks like this, and all we want to do is just turn this whole thing so that it is right side out. So I'm going to flip it like that, and when I get to where my pointy corners are, I'm going to use my seam turner to push that out as much as I can without pushing it through the fabric so that I've got a nice crisp point, kind of like that. And I'm going to do the same thing with the other side. Okay, so now we've got our collar turned right side out, but it's not really wanting to stay in shape, so we are going to press this into shape as best we can. So basically, I'm just going to line up these raw edges of this open edge first, and I'm going to try to kind of wiggle the inside seam so that it is as flat as possible. And it's kind of a trick where you can kind of roll the fabric back and forth between your fingers on a seam like that to make sure that it lays flat on the inside. So that looks good there. I'm going to do the same thing over here on the right side. All right, so here is the point of our collar right here, and I want to do a top edge stitch, kind of like we did with our front band here. So when I do my top stitch on this, I'm going to start at the top corner, work my way to this corner, work all the way around, and then back up here. And here you can sew this shut if you want to, just do it real close to the edge. All right, so now we have a collar that looks like this, and all we have to do is put it into the collar stand and then attach it to our shirt. So let's talk about how to do that. Now to prepare our collar stand, you don't have to do anything with the interface side for right now, but all we're going to do is we're going to take the straight edge of the collar stand lining, and we're going to press this up by 1 seam allowance, so about 1/2 inch or 5/8 of an inch all the way across. And it does kind of curve a little bit, so do your best to make sure that it curves with the raw edge of the fabric. Keep in mind the wrong side of your fabric should be face up on your ironing board when you roll this over. Alright, so now to put our whole collar together, what we're going to do is move our collar stand lining, and I'm going to flip the interface side over of the actual collar stand. So this should be right side up. Now, I'm going to match up the notches of my collar with the collar stand, and I'm going to pin those together. It might be kind of hard to see the notches, but I can see them very clearly right here. So I'm going to pin those 2 double notches together first. Now, as you can see, the collar bends the opposite direction of the actual collar stand, so I have to kind of force this to follow that bend, which is not that hard to do. It's not like doing a sleeve. So I'm just going to pin that all the way so that those edges are nice and flush with each other like that. And now I'm just going to do the same thing on the other side. Alright, so you should have something that looks like this, and if you see that your collar is rippling at all, don't worry about that. That's totally okay. And now the last part is we are going to take the other half of our collar stand, and we're going to line this up with the interface part of our collar stand. And you're going to want this so that the side we pressed over is on top, facing you. Now what we want to do is I'm going to pin this so that the left side of our 2 collar stands are pinned together, and the right sides of our collar stands are pinned together. And then I'm just going to try to feel where the other pins were, and I'm going to pin through all 4 layers. And I'm going to do this all the way across the top. Alright, now if there's any other pins on the inside, I usually take those out just because they will kind of only get in the way as we're getting ready to sew this thing together. Alright, now when you have everything lined up, it should look like this. We've got our collar stand lining on top, we've got our completed collar in the middle, and then underneath that we have our interfaced collar stand here. So what we're going to do is try to lay this flat, and we're going to do a stitch that starts here at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. We're going to go around this curve all the way across this entire thing, and then we're going to curve around this edge and end right where that fold is there. Take your pins out as you go so that you don't get any pleats, and then I will explain how this is going to work after we're done with that stitch. Alright, so we should have a nice stitch that goes all the way around like that, and now what I'm going to do is very carefully trim my seam so it is pretty close to where those stitches were. Okay, so here's how everything makes sense now. So we're going to turn this whole thing right side out. So what you're going to notice is the collar's going to pop out like this, and I'm going to want this so that the interfaced part of the collar stand is against my ironing board. I'm going to try to turn the corners of where the collar stand are. I'm going to try to lay this as flat as I can. Now it's really important to try to lay the fabric as flat as you can because we're going to iron this just like this. So I'm going to kind of start in the middle, and I'm going to stretch the fabric so that we don't get any weird uneven pressure when we're pressing this into shape. And because we turned over about 1/2 inch of our collar stand lining, you should be able to see plenty of the interface side on the bottom here. Alright, good. Once you've got that all pressed, I like to flip this over, and I want to press my collar just so that I can make sure that it's all flat and everything looks nice and clean there. Alright, now our collar is pressed and it is ready, so we can put this on our shirt right now. Alright, so now lay your shirt down so that it is right side up and you're looking at your neckline here. And what I want to do is I'm going to fold this in half so that I can find the center middle of my back panel. So if I fold this perfectly in half like that, I'm going to put a pin right through the center so I know where the exact center is. So as I lay this flat and kind of open it up, I've got my direct center point here. And then I'm going to do the same thing with my collar, where I'm going to fold it in half, find the absolute center, and I'm going to put a pin through that as well. So now what you want to do is you're going to lay your interfaced side of your collar stand against that edge of the center back so that those two center points are matched up perfectly. I'm going to hold these with my fingers, pull out the pins, and then I'm going to pin through just the interface side of the collar stand and the back of the shirt. Okay, so we have our center point of our collar pinned in place. Now I want to make sure that this point right here matches up with the edge of our front band right there, because we're going to start stitching right here, and I want to make sure that's absolutely flush with our fabric. So I'm going to hold that with my fingers, and I'm going to put a pin through those layers just like that. Make sure you don't pin the lining down. You're going to need to pull this back, so just make sure that you don't pin through that. Okay, now kind of like with the sleeve, this is going to kind of bend a little bit, so I'm going to pull these real tight together, and I can tell these aren't matching up, so what I want to do is kind of drag these two panels of fabric so that the raw edges match up with each other. And again, this is just the interface side, not the lining side. So those are pinned together now. Then I'm going to do the same thing between these two pins, where I'm going to line up the raw edges there. Then I'm going to line up these raw edges right here. Alright, so now we have the left side of the collar pinned in place, and I'm going to do the same exact thing on the right side, where I'm going to start all the way over here in this corner and make sure those points match up, and then I'm going to do the same thing to pin this together. Alright, so I know this looks kind of unusual, and I am going to do a close-up on how I do this stitch, but we're going to start over here, and then we're going to stitch just the interface side to the back panel all the way across, and I'll show you how this works. Alright, so doing the collar is kind of a two-phase thing. So what we're going to do is, I'm going to take out my first pin, and again, let me hold this up. I want to make sure that right in that little V between those two layers of fabric, that's where our stitch starts. And I do not want to sew any of the collar facing lining at all. So I'm going to start as close to that as I can. I'm going to do a little front and back stitch off the edge. Now, as I do this, I want to stay on a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, so I can kind of peel this lining back, which makes it really easy. So now I can just sew the interface part of our collar right to our shirt, and that lining isn't going to get in the way at all. So I'm just going to go all the way to the other side, and I'm going to remove pins as I go along. Okay, now as I come up to the other end here, it's going to be hard to keep the lining out of the way, but what I want to do, I hope you can see this, is I'm going to take out my last pin and hold it with my finger like that. And I want my last stitch to go right through, right where the lining connects to the interface part. Do a little back stitch and then go all the way off. And if you get this perfectly, you're going to have this absolutely seamless finish on where your collar matches the rest of the parts of your shirt, and it looks really good. Now, I just noticed an error that I made, and I'm really happy this happened during this tutorial, because I wanted to show you guys how to fix this if this happens. So I've got this weird pleat right here, and actually if I show you the outside of the collar, it's going to make this weird kind of awkward pleat, and we don't want that. And I'm going to show you how to fix that right now. All you have to do to fix one of these little pleats like this is take a seam ripper and just pop out the stitch right where it's pleating right there. Now I'm just going to kind of tug on the fabric, and it's going to start to kind of unravel some of those stitches right there. Now I want to pop out as many stitches as I need to so that I can make sure that this is going to lay flat. Alright, so I just took out about maybe 2 or 3 inches worth of stitches right there, and now I can actually see this on the other side where I know it's laying flat. So all I have to do now is just line this up with my sewing machine where those stitches ended. I'm going to do a quick little stitch and a back stitch. I'm going to make sure that there's nothing else underneath this fabric so that we've got a nice clean stitch. I'm going to pull this fairly tight and I'm going to stitch until it lines up with our other stitches and then do a back stitch. Alright, so here's our little recovery stitch, which lays nice and flat, and if I turn this right side out, I no longer see any pleats right there, which looks really good. So if you get any issues with your sleeves or your collar, it's very simple to kind of correct that error. Alright, so now that we have our collar sewn in, we have to press this one more time and then we get to do our top stitch. So let's go press this. Alright, so we're looking at the inside of our shirt, and I got my lining is still nice and loose up here, and we've got a seam right here that I actually want to keep this seam at that length because it's going to give some structure to our collar stand. However, there is one part I want to thin out a little bit. So this part of the seam right here is really thick, and our lining has to cover it in a curved way. So what I'm going to do is pull all of the lining away from this, and I'm going to trim this seam kind of in a rounded way without cutting through any of those stitches so that it should look a little bit thinner like that. What we're going to do is we're going to end up tucking this seam under that lining, so it's going to sit kind of like that, and then we're going to end up pressing this and stitching over that so you can't see any of those seams, kind of like we did with the front bands here. So again, this is the other side, and I'm going to just trim very close to those stitches and kind of round off that seam so that it will hide underneath the lining just a little bit more easily. Okay, now what we're going to do is we're going to lift up the lining so that it's not in the way, and I'm going to take my iron and I'm going to press the seam up towards the top of the shirt. We're going to do that all the way from left to right. Okay, good. So that's all up. And if this starts to wrinkle down here, don't worry about that because we can iron that later. But now I'm going to pull my lining down and I'm going to make sure that this all kind of looks the way it's supposed to look when it's finished. Okay, now just like we did with the front bands, I'm going to take the folded over lining and I'm just going to barely cover those stitches like we did before. I'm going to take a pin and put it right through the edge of that folded fabric through all the layers, and I'm going to push this through all the layers to hold that in place like that. And I'm going to pin this all the way to the left and right edges of this collar. Alright, this looks excellent. So we've got this pinned all the way across where that lining is in place. So what we're going to do is I'm going to flip this over. We're going to take this over to our sewing machine, and I'm going to stitch this lower edge, pulling out my pins as I go along, just like we did with the front bands. So we're going to do that all the way across. Alright, so again, this is one of those top stitches that's going to lock the lining in place. So I've got my seam right here, and I'm going to be stitching about 1/8 of an inch to the right of that to try to lock the lining in place. So I'm just going to start by doing a little front and back stitch right there. And then we are going to push forward. And I'm at about 1/8 of an inch from the edge of that seam right there. So I'm actually going to keep my left arm underneath my shirt so I can pull out the pins as I'm going here. Alright, now as I get to my edge, I'm going to do the same back stitch and then run all the way off. Cut my thread, and now I'm going to check to see how this looks. Alright, so as you can see on the inside, I've got this so that it is actually covering all of the lining all the way across, so this is completely sealed on the inside. It's not perfectly clean, but on the outside it looks absolutely perfect, so that's what we're looking for. Alright, now I'm going to take this over and I'm going to press this so it's nice and flat, and then we're going to do our final top stitch. Alright, so for the final top stitch on our collar stand, I like to line it up with these stitches that we put on the front of our shirt. So I'm going to kind of line up my needle with where those stitches end, do a little front and back stitch, and then I'm going to very carefully follow the curve of the collar stand. And I'm going to edge stitch as close as I can to where the collar stand ends and where the collar begins. And as I'm coming around this curve here, I'm going to try to do the same thing where I'm going to match up my stitch with these stitches on the right side of our front opening here. Do a little back stitch, cut my thread, and we are completely done with the construction of the shirt itself right now. Okay, so the collar is completely done. This looks really good, and there's just one last thing that we have to do where I am going to turn my shirt upside down, and I'm looking at the right side of the shirt, and all I'm going to do is turn the collar over just barely before where the collar stand is, and I'm going to press this so that the collar is going down towards the shirt, unless you want a collar that's popped up at all times. I am just going to press this into shape. You don't have to sew it or anything. This is just to keep it in the proper shape. Now that we have our collar pressed, you should have something that looks something like this, and the last thing we have to do is just put on our buttons and buttonholes. It's important to mention that traditionally, if you're a man, buttons go on the right side of your shirt and buttonholes go on the left side. So I'm going to show you how to set up for doing buttons and buttonholes right now. So this is the left opening of my shirt, and this is where my buttonholes are going to go. So I'm going to line up the pattern of my band with this edge of my shirt. And this pattern has a place that tells you where every button and buttonhole will go all the way along here. So all I have to do is just kind of draw a straight line up from there, and I'm going to make little marks with chalk in my shirt everywhere that it says to do a buttonhole. Okay, so hopefully you can see all my white chalk marks here, and this is where my buttonholes are going to go. Now, I know that my buttonholes are going to start here, and they're going to go down the shirt about an inch, all the way down the shirt. So when I do my button markings, I want to make sure it's right in the middle of those, and I'll show you how I do that. Alright, now to transfer my chalk marks to the other side, instead of using my pattern, since I already have these marked here, I know where they're going to be. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go about maybe a 1/4 inch down from where my original marking was, because I know that's where my button's going to need to go. So I'm making chalk marks, again, about a 1/4 inch or so lower than where my buttonholes are going to start. So these are not going to be perfectly even, but everything is going to work out just perfectly. Again, just as a close-up, I know my buttonhole is going to start here and go down to about here. So my button marking is going to fit right between where that buttonhole is going to go. That's why I do it this way. Alright, so now it's time to do our buttons and buttonholes, which is the final step of making a shirt. Thankfully, I've already shot a tutorial video on how to machine sew buttons and buttonholes into fabric. So if you click this link right here, it will take you to a video that I made that's going to teach you how to do that onto your shirt. Now, if you've already seen that video or you already know how to do buttons and buttonholes, just hang out for 1 second and I am going to finish my shirt. Alright, so my shirt is all done and I cleaned up all my loose threads and we got our buttons and buttonholes on there, which look great. And I wanted to just mention that every time I make a shirt, I keep an extra copy of the breast pocket just for fun. So just as an example, this is my stack of all of my extra breast pockets that I've got collected. This is actually the shirt I'm wearing right now. But if your guys' shirt didn't turn out well, I just wanted to show that, you know, I've made a lot of shirts and I've got a lot of practice. So if yours didn't turn out perfectly, don't beat yourself up, but keep working at it. And also, I recommend using lots of fun fabrics like these because there are some really cool fabrics out there. Okay, so I am all done with my shirt. I haven't even tried this on, so I'm going to put this on and I want to see how it looks. Alright, so this is my first official fitting test, and I think this turned out pretty well, and my collar is nice and clean. I like my embroidery, the pocket looks good. Something I want to mention is I did do a video on how to tailor a men's t-shirt, and this is a little baggy on me. So my next video, I'm going to show you how to tailor a button-down shirt just like this one so that it's going to look a little bit more fitted, kind of like this or something like that. So you can take any pre-existing button-down shirt and make it tailored and fitted to fit you perfectly. I would like to thank all of you for watching this tutorial and all the little spin-off tutorials I've been making. It's been a lot of fun teaching you guys how to make certain projects, and I'm really happy, and all of your comments have been so wonderful. So thank you so much for all your support. If any of you end up making a shirt like this and you'd like to share it with me on Twitter or Instagram, please tag me at Tock Custom and put something like hashtag Tock shirt or something like that, so that I can keep track of what you guys are making and celebrate what we're all doing together. If you have any questions about this video or any other videos you'd like to see, please let me know in the comments. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video where we tailor this shirt.